Vinland Saga is an anime that's been on my radar for quite some time now. And it does get periodically recommended to me, but what I found is it started to show up almost from its first release back in 2019 in lists of the top anime of all time. If we go here to my anime list top 100, we can see there's a lot of stuff that you'd expect up here. Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, Steins Gate, Attack on Titan, Clannad, Evangelion. I think Evangelion's a bit lower. Cowboy Bebop. And then you come down to number 38 and you have Vinland Saga, which is ahead of Code Geass. It's even ahead of like Princess Mononoke. And these are the anime series that are regarded as being the best shows ever, or kind of the exemplars of what an anime movie or TV show can and should be. Now, you might agree or disagree with the picks here, but it's a bit like when you talk about The Omen or Rosemary's Baby with horror movies, or Silence of the Lambs with thrillers, or Casablanca with romantic period pieces. This is what's generally agreed upon as being the best in the field. So you have this weird anime that's not like from back in the day. There's not nostalgia propelling it, something like Cowboy Bebop. You have this historical anime that makes at least some attempt to be historically accurate about Vikings that came out in 2019, and it's up there. It's near the very top, and it's just kind of strange to me. So there was that aspect to it. There's also the aspect that how good a job can the Japanese do talking about the Norse? I mean, their record, I think, on dealing with medieval Europe is kind of mixed. Because on one hand, they don't come at it with all the baggage that the modern left has imposed upon medieval history or even like Victorian history. You don't have the same like obsession with like racism or religious. Well, actually, there is with religious bigotry, but it's not nearly as universally negative as what you see trying to be portrayed often in Western media. You have a lot of stuff like Dark Souls or Castlevania, at least before Netflix butchered it, that really kind of celebrates the aesthetic and the music and stuff like that. Classical music's really big in Japan, that kind of thing. On the other hand, they really don't understand Western culture at all. In particular, they don't understand Christianity whatsoever. All the portrayals of Christianity I think I've ever seen in Japanese stuff shows a lack of understanding of the very basics of the religion. And that's certainly true in Vinland Saga. And religion was very important during this time period as the Norse were undergoing Christianization. So you have kind of these two things. There's going to be some good things about the Japanese making it, and there's going to be some bad things about the Japanese making it. And so a friend of mine really wanted me to watch this, so a dub came out, and I tend to prefer dubs, so I just said, okay, you know what? Let's watch Vinland Saga. And I guess the question is, does it live up to the hype? And I'm gonna say, yeah, it does. It's like Attack on Titan. I think it does live up, and I do think it is justified in the position it's in. Now, I guess one other note before we get into the show. One of the reasons I was very hesitant to watch this is a time period I'm just really not interested in. There's a lot of reasons I don't really care about the Dark Ages. First one being is that it's the Dark Ages, and there's not very much historical material from this time period. So, like, I was trying to read a biography of Charlemagne, and it was like 700 pages long. And I swear, like, 70% of it is, we don't know, but maybe this. Oh, I don't know, but maybe that. I just find there isn't really the same personalities. There's not really the same empire. I guess there are some empires, like the Carolingians and stuff. You just don't have the same, like, civilizations and centralized states and kind of the other stuff that I find interesting about other time periods. A lot of it's just kind of a mystery. It's just very decentralized, very anarchaic. Well, it's not nearly like as bad as modern history often portrays it. It is very much a long, slow recovery from the fall of the Roman Empire. So that being said, I had a bias against this going into it. That I was just like, I'm not interested in this time period. The Vikings, as far as I'm concerned, are like an embarrassing chapter of European history that I think is probably best forgotten. But I said, you know what? Let's just watch it. Let's see how this show is. So I was kind of surprised watching this because I do know a little bit about this time period, just because I know at least a little bit about most historical time periods. And I'd say the show is probably about 70% historically accurate. They get a lot of things right about it. They get the major factions right. They get a lot of the terminology right. They don't attempt to blunt or diminish how violent this time is. They make no attempt to romanticize the Vikings. I'd say the historical characters who show up are probably, well, Canute is not, but I guess Svein is a lot higher on the Svein or Sven, however you pronounce it, is a lot higher on the historical accuracy. Obviously, this is an anime, so a lot of the fight scenes get kind of very anime-ish and over the top. But this isn't a fantasy series. I thought there was going to be dark fantasy elements. There really isn't. There's a couple of times where people have dreams, but there isn't fantasy elements. They're trying to be realistic and they're trying at least somewhat to follow the historical narrative, which is something I appreciate and something that was very unexpected but welcome. So before we get into the story, the historical setting that this is set in, I know that's kind of repetitive, is the main character, Thorfinn, lives in Iceland. Now, Greenland is also colonized in this, and Leif Erikson is a major character in the first couple episodes, and he comes back at the end, and I'd imagine he's probably going to be important in season 2, and he's, of course, known as the man who discovered Vinland or Newfoundland, if that is where Vinland was. And historically, he was known for being sent by the King of Denmark to Christianize Greenland, and this is kind of referenced in how he needs to go to France to get wine to celebrate Mass, because you can't use mead or beer, you have to use grape wine. So he's in it. He's kind of this really cool older grandfather figure. Of all the like evil psychopaths in this show, he's one of the few genuinely good characters. But I kind of digress. So Thorfinn is a kid who lives in Iceland with his father Thors. And Thors is a Giga Chad who used to be known as the Troll of Yorm, but he got tired of a life of extreme violence, faked his own death, and fled to Iceland. At one point, they described the colonization of Iceland, and I don't know if this is the historically what happened, but King Harold, I'm not sure if it's Harold Bluetooth or Harold Greycloak. And yes, Bluetooth is named after this Harold Bluetooth, the wireless technology, I mean, but was trying to unify Norway and Denmark. The historical record of this time period, like I said, is kind of a mess, and they fled his attempts to create a unified kingdom to Iceland and then eventually to Greenland. So at the time of the thing, of the show, Svein or Sven, I'm not sure, I'm just going to call him Svein Forkbeard, the king of Denmark, who is also the king of Norway. Sweden doesn't really exist during this time period, but the king of the Faroe Islands, Iceland. It's kind of ambiguous what he actually controls or not. But you have this entity called the North Seas Empire. And the North Seas Empire was a brief period in which the Danes succeeded in conquering Norway, Iceland, Greenland, the Faroe Islands, England, and then I think Ireland and Scotland also submitted. Once again, it's kind of ambiguous because this isn't like a modern centralized state. It's more of a personal union. But Spain is preparing for a big push into England that will finally destroy the Anglo-Saxon kingdom and fully subjugate it. And this, I'd imagine this is because England is a big prize because it's much better for farmland and all kinds of resources that the home islands, or I guess the home, whatever you want to call them, that Scandinavia lacks during this time period. So a group of Vikings come to Iceland because they need Thor's back, and we kind of get like a wood shopping your country needs you scene. And basically they say, we're going to destroy this village unless you come back out of retirement and become a major player again. So he agrees to go with them, and a bunch of other men from the village go with them. And Thorfinn, I think he's 8 at the time, sneaks on board the ship. He stows away. They aren't able to turn the ship around back to Iceland, so he's going to go with them. And now we enter who I would argue is really the real main character of this season, Askeladd. And once again, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. But so Askeladd is one of the most complex and fascinating villains I've ever seen in anime. This show, I think, really knows how to play to its strengths, and its strengths are its characters, and the fight scenes. We don't really have much slice of life humor, like random stuff interjected in it. I think the show very much gets that the relationship between Thorfinn and Askeladd is really the height of the show. It's what people care about, and they try to really keep it focused on that, which is something that I really appreciate. But anyways, Askeladd is hired to kill Thors, and he sets an ambush for him off the Faroe Islands, which, if you don't know, the Faroe Islands are a Danish dependency that's north of Scotland. It's strategically important because it's kind of in between the British Isles, Iceland, and Norway. And they get there and they find out the whole thing is a trap. And Thors challenges Askeladd to a duel, and he says, "If I win, you have to let us all go." So Askeladd promises to let them all go if he wins. And we're going to start getting into major spoilers now, just so you know. And they have their fight. Thors wins. And he decides, though, to allow Askeladd to get away, provided Askeladd lets his men go. But he will submit to being executed or being killed and not put up more of a fight if everyone else is allowed to leave. So Askeladd swears once again. Now, it's important to note with Askeladd, if he swears on his father, he's not going to keep it. If he swears on his ancestor, he will die to keep it because he hates his father, but his heritage is extremely important to him and is the core of his identity. And you can tell almost immediately because most people wear some sort of chainmail, like Viking chainmail or whatever, but he wears a musculatus, whatever the thing is that you always see hoplites wearing. Very Roman, and indeed a lot of his clothing has a very Roman tint to it, which will become very important later on. But they're like fighting at the bottom of a fjord. Just watch the show. It's fairly straightforward. It's kind of hard to explain. But Thors gets gunned down by a bunch of archers. Askeladd allows the men to leave. Thorfinn, however, refuses to leave. He sneaks on board their ship, and he's going to stab Askeladd when he's sleeping, but he decides not to because he's his father's son, and he doesn't think it would matter. He needs to beat Askeladd in an actual duel. So he goes through kind of like a Gohan-esque training thing in the wild, and he comes back and duels Askeladd and gets his ass kicked. And then Askeladd goes to Britain proper, and he stows away. And eventually, kind of what happens is most of the series is the relationship between Askeladd and Thorfinn. And it is very weird because Askeladd is a man of a lot of contradictions. He's extremely evil, but he's very aware of how evil he is. Like, he'd be the first person to admit that he's a massive piece of shit. He's exceedingly greedy and brutal and willing to do anything. But at the same time, once we get into it, his ultimate motivations are not particularly selfish. His personal safety, his personal advancement is only a means to an end. And we'll get into that in a minute. So, Thorfinn, I think it's very important to keep in mind because he kind of goes down a very dark path. The dude has extreme PTSD. He has like guts level PTSD. He has like Subaru from ReZero level PTSD. He watched his father get killed. He's alone. He's like a kid with all these insane, brutal Vikings who are raping or killing everything. And very early on, Askeladd starts to use him as his spy and infiltrator. So there's kind of a moral event horizon where they send him to infiltrate a English village, and to send up a light of fire to let them have the all clear signal that there's not a garrison and that they can get a surprise attack. So he goes in. There's an English Christian family who decides to help him out. And despite that, he calls in the Ashkelad's Vikings, and then they rape and kill everyone and steal everything. And Ashkelad just kind of dangles this in front of him that if he keeps doing these services for him, that he'll get to duel him again and again. And Thorfinn always gets his ass kicked. And towards the end of the series, Ashkelad's like, all you ever do is just rush at me. It doesn't matter how much better you get in terms of fighting, you just do the same thing every time. So Thorfinn is kind of like a DPS rogue class. So he fights with two daggers, and he's just extremely fast and agile and that sort of thing. And he kind of becomes the commando of the Viking unit. Ashkelad will send him in to kill the enemy war chief. He'll go in to lower drawbridges to just kind of be the general, like I said, commando ranger unit. And we have this kind of bizarre frenemy, abusive father-son relationship that develops between them. One of the issues with Ashkelad is he's such a liar, it's kind of hard to tell where he is. Like throughout it, he kind of seems to care more about his men, and he treats them better than a lot of other leaders in the series do. But later on, and we're getting into even more spoilers now, he says, I hate you all. I hate Danes. Danes are disgusting, subhuman filth. But out of all the people, the only one he seems to have any respect for is Thorfinn. And even if he makes fun of Thor's, I think he respects Thor's for being a better man than him. For at least being someone who was worth killing, if that makes sense. It's kind of like if you've seen the movie Gangs of New York, Bill the Butcher talks about. Bill the Butcher has a very similar relationship to, I think his name is Brooklyn, Leonardo DiCaprio's character, who he killed his father, but he enters into Bill the Butcher's employ, and they kind of have this father-son relationship. And Bill the Butcher talks about Leo's father, and he says he was the only man I killed whose name was worth remembering. And I kind of feel to a certain extent Ashkelad's like that. And he sends Thorfinn into these dangerous situations that he's completely unprepared for, that he doesn't expect him to survive. But he comes to become like his second most loyal, useful soldier because of how crazy he is and because he's so easy to manipulate to do whatever he wants by promising him a duel. So I think ultimately, in the end of the day, and you can see this towards the end, Ashkelad does have a certain respect for Thorfinn, maybe even kind of views him as the son that he'd never had. And even if Thorfinn hates Ashkelad and his entire existence revolves around killing him, his entire existence does revolve around him. It's a bit like with Darth Vader, and Darth Vader has this weird codependent relationship with the Emperor, because the Emperor is the only person left who really knows who he is, and he's kind of the only person he has in the world. Likewise, Ashkelad is the only person that Thorfinn has in the world, and he's extremely emotionally dependent upon him. And it is really bizarre, but a very interesting and complex relationship. So as the show goes on, we kind of gradually learn more and more about Ashkelad, and he has this big 40 chess plan. And once again, we're presented throughout that he's just kind of this mindless psychopath who just wants money and wealth and stuff. But towards, I guess, the two-thirds mark, we get a reveal that he is actually from Wales. His father was a Viking, and his mother was Welsh, and she was a descendant of King Arthur. And he views the rightful inhabitants of the British Isles as being the Romano-British. He views the Romano-British as being a synthesis of Roman culture and Celtic culture, and he views the Anglo-Saxons and the Danes as being interlopers who came in and destroyed his civilization. And he views Wales as the last remnant of the Romano-British and of the Celtic peoples. Obviously, Ireland and Scotland are also Celtic, but they weren't part of the Roman Empire. So he does kind of LARP as a Roman, as the last descendant of Arthur. and he reveals everything he's done has been to try to protect Wales from destruction by the Vikings. And ultimately, his motives are arguably not selfish because he just does genuinely love his homeland. And it wasn't all about personal enrichment. So now we enter Canute. Now, Canute is once again a historical figure. He's the second son in this of Svein, Forkbeard, and he comes along with his father to England. Now, he gets captured, but he gets saved by Askeladd, and Askeladd's plan is to make Canute the king and to be his right hand man, and to use his influence on Canute to get him to stop the Danes from destroying Wales. Now, there's another aspect to it, and a lot of people have compared this show to Berserk, and I think that is a very apt comparison. Totally, it's very similar. Artistically, it's somewhat similar. Plot wise, it's kind of similar. The relationship between Thorfinn and Askeladd does kind of remind me of the relationship between Guts and Griffith, where it's this really unhealthy, kind of codependent relationship. And it is this very, like, unabashed portrayal of the absolute horrors of war, kind of stripped away all forms of romanticism, where people switch sides at the drop of a hat, where mercenaries rule and that kind of thing. But Canute is really a symbol of that, because Canute looks suspiciously like Griffith. Let me just pull up a picture. So this is a picture of Canute, and as I said, you might notice he has what looks like a falcon mask. He's a pretty boy with long blonde hair. So like if we look at, let me see if I can find another picture of Canute. But he looks a lot like Griffith. Like almost exactly like Griffith. And he has kind of a similar personality to Griffith, at least eventually. And his goal is basically exactly the same as Griffith. So I don't know if it's supposed to be a reference or what it is, but he shows up. Initially, he's extremely shy. He was raised by a Danish knight, Sir Ragnar, who's kind of a dick, but is in general a good person. He was raised as a devout Christian. Now, the historical Canute was a very devout Christian. He was also an extremely brutal man, but is regarded as being one of the greatest kingdoms that England ever had prior to the Norman conquest. So there's that aspect to it. And when we have Canute, we get into what is probably the only really G slur thing that happens in this show. So Ragnar gets killed, and some other really dark stuff happens. And then there's this drunk nihilistic priest who's with them. And basically Canute has this breakdown and goes on this like 10-minute rant about the nature of love. And he's just like talking about the problem of evil, and he's like, God's not intervening to stop the horrors of the world. Everybody on earth is completely evil. There's no good, there's no evil, there's no good people, there's no bad people. Everybody just sucks. Everything just sucks. And he kind of throws this temper tantrum. And it's really incoherent. But basically, at the end, he says, I'm going to create a heaven on earth. I'm going to create my own utopia where everybody's happy, where everyone's prosperous. I want my own kingdom. That's my dream. My dream is to have my own kingdom, and I will call it Falconia. I mean, the North Seas Empire. So he becomes like a misotheist or something. He believes that God is evil, following this, and he completely abandons his Christian faith, which is ahistorical, and I think it's just like a fedora thing that the Japanese like to insert into everything. Although, to be fair, they portray Norse paganism even worse, as all the devout followers of it are complete psychopaths. And this is kind of another aspect of Askeladd where I'm not entirely sure if his relationship with Canute is 100% him wanting to control Canute, or he wants Canute to be his, or he sees Canute as a messianic figure and as the only person who can bring order from the chaos. Because Askeladd really despises the Viking era. He hates all the violence. the lack of order. He wants things to kind of go back to how they were during the Roman period, where you had a strong state, you had a professional army, that sort of thing. And once again, he engages in the behaviors he hates, but he freely acknowledges that he's a massive piece of shit and he deserves whatever he gets. That in no way tempers his evil, though, which is once again kind of an interesting thing about him. So there's a chance that he legitimately does see Canute as a messianic figure, that he does actually believe that he's one of the few people who would be able to make the world a better place. Almost kind of like a Varus figure to Aegon the Sixth. And then this kind of leads us to the last arc of season 1, where Canute has done like a complete 180. He's now this like badass master schemer, and they figure out that his father wants to kill him, get him killed off under suspicious circumstances so his older brother can inherit, but he decides that he's going to kill off his father first. And basically he's having to go up against Askeladd, who's a genius, and he comes up with putting Askeladd in a no-win scenario. So he figures out where Askeladd's from and that he loves whales. So basically he tells Askeladd, okay, you can join me as my advisor and kill Canute, or I'll invade Wales. And you can have one but not the other. So Askeladd kind of ultimately, it's kind of a death equals redemption, or I don't know if it's really a death equals redemption, but it's a death equals the highest priority was never his life and never his advancement. So he pretends to go insane and claims that he is the real king of Britain as a descendant of Arthur. And he kills Svein and just kind of goes on a rampage, and ultimately Canute strikes him down. Now, interestingly, during this, Thorfinn kind of comes in, and Askeladd gets really upset because he doesn't want Thorfinn to get involved in this and defend him because he's the only one who can kill him. And after Canute strikes him down, he does actually hurt Canute. And he's given a chance after Canute strikes him down to land the finishing blow. And at this, in a prior episode, Askeladd talks about his backstory, about how his father was a massive piece of shit who killed his mother and took him in as like a soldier, and he killed his father in his sleep. And he just tells Thorfinn that basically he's a massive pussy and he should have killed him a long time ago. And the fact that he's been spending 8 years doing it and he's never gotten anywhere is evidence that he's a pussy. But at the same time, he also just says, look, dude, your entire life is following me, the guy you hate, the guy you want to kill around. If you ever killed me, what would you do? And he kind of almost implies that Thorfinn is deliberately hamstringing himself so he won't beat Askeladd because he's dependent upon Askeladd, and if Askeladd dies, he's completely fucked. And there's nothing that he can really do. There's no place he can go. His home is, at this point in time, a complete and total mystery to him. He probably feels too ashamed to even go back to Denmark at this point. So he gets his chance to kill Askeladd finally, and he does it. He does, however, kind of come to terms with how horrendous the last however many years have been, the horrific things he's done, and it all kind of comes back to him. Now, almost like a sign from God, Leif shows up, and Leif has been trying to find him for the entire duration, and he initially rebuffs him, saying, I gotta kill Askeladd, but now that Askeladd's dead, Leif is really the only place he can go. He could try to serve Canute, but he really has no interest in serving Canute because he doesn't really care about the whole geopolitical situation. And if I had been writing this, or I guess another Christian would have been writing this, this would have been a really good time for Thorfinn to convert to Christianity, seeking redemption, to be baptized and have his sins washed away, and to try to spend the rest of his life being trying to make amends for the horrible things that he's done. And Thorfinn, despite the stuff he's done, to be fair, I don't think is fundamentally a bad person. He had extreme PTSD and grew up under really horrendous situations, but it's never really shown that he has any kind of love of cruelty or sadism. He's more just very single-minded and just views everything as being secondary. He's just become numb to the constant violence. And that's the end of Vinland Saga Season 1. So overall, I think it's really good. You have a lot of thematic depth. You have a lot of very good characters. I'd recommend the dub because Ashkalad's voice actor is really funny. He has this great, just shit eating laugh that he does. Like, it's almost kind of like a Joker laugh. But yeah, overall, I'd say great show, highly recommended. I'd probably give it a 9 out of 10, which is really high considering, once again, it's a time period that doesn't really interest me much. But this manages to bring it to life and make it really interesting. So, highly recommend Vinland Saga. Go give it a watch.